Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 34, Advice at Last. Yang Xiaolong. Wise. Pushing open the door of a room, Yang took a quick look inside to see that it was just as empty as the last three. She had checked and closed it again to continue her search. While the house wasn't anywhere as large as the mansion, the number of rooms it still managed to hold was astounding. Though as she was trying to find her girlfriend, who had stormed angrily from the room they'd been sat in, it was slightly more annoying than she would have normally found it to be. She could only imagine what was going through Weiss' mind at that moment, as even though Yang didn't really know Winter, the story still made her feel a little sick. The cruelty Winter's father had apparently shown towards his own daughter for just wanting to live her own life was horrible. The way he had twisted situations, used the people she loved against her, could he even still be called a father? Or would the monster be a more fitting description? Yang was leaning more towards the latter than ever. But what about Weiss? From the story Winter told him, and the way she spoke of her father, it seemed like the woman had never liked the man anyway, but Weiss had never spoken of him like that. She had expressed annoyance, even exasperation, but she had never said she hated him. In truth, Yang doubted whether she did hate him, that a part of her still cared for him. However, after having heard the story, after how Weiss had reacted throughout its telling, Yang didn't know if those beliefs were correct anymore. Letting out a deep sigh, Yang pushed open another door to be met with a small lounge, but no white-haired girl sat on its chairs. Fortunately though, as she gently closed the door, Yang heard a small bang from a nearby room and quickly made her way towards it. Turning the corner, she found herself in the kitchen she had seen when they had first arrived, and while normally she would have found it funny that she had somehow managed to get lost in the house, the fact that Weiss was facing away from her slamming cupboard while she prepared a glass of water took up more of her attention. "There you are," Yang said gently, standing in the archway watching the girl take a glass from the cupboard, her grip on it so tight that Yang was half worried it would smash. "Are you okay?" "No," the snowy-haired girl replied shortly, and shoved the glass into a small opening in the fridge door to fill it with ice and water. "I am not okay, Yang. Figured that hoping for a yes was. Every time I think he cannot do anything worse." Weiss interrupted her, clearly not listening. "Every time I think he has done everything he can to destroy the reputation of my grandfather's company, I discover yet another thing that he has kept buried. Yeah, underpaid honest labor, aggressive acquisition tactics, almost doubling the price of the medical technology we develop." Weiss continued angrily, taking the full glass from the opening and placing it on the table. "But this, using the company to actively go out of his way to ruin hundreds of people's lives for no other reason than because someone defied him. My grandfather started it to help people. He put everything he had into making life better for everyone, and that is what I want to take over. That is the company I want to run, but I don't know if the STC is even that anymore. Every year it strays further and further away, and I don't know if I can even fix it when I take over." Watching the girl bend over the table, Yang saw a droplet hit the hardwood surface and felt her heart drop. She hated that Weiss was questioning herself, and wanting to try and make her feel better, she walked over and placed her hand over Weiss. "If anyone can change the company, it's you, Weiss," she said quietly and sat down on the stool, Weiss quickly sitting down on the one next to her. "But," Yang cut herself off, unsure as to what she was going to suggest. "But what?" The woman sighed and took a sip of her drink. "Well, I don't really know much about business," Yang said slowly and felt Weiss' fingers part so that hers could slip between them. "But if you really don't think you can change it, if you think it's too far gone, why not start your own one?" For the first time since she had found her, Weiss' face turned to look at her. There was surprise in the woman's beautiful blue eyes, and thankfully far fewer tears than Yang had expected, but after a couple of seconds, a gentle smile pulled at her girlfriend's lips. "I can't," she said with a small shrug and a shake of her head as she turned away. "The company means too much to me. My grandfather means too much. I don't think he would be disappointed if you tried to honor him with something else, Weiss." "I know that," Weiss softly, and looked down at her drink. "But there's more to it. I was 5 when my grandfather passed away. I don't remember much of the days I spent with him, but he was such a good man, and the company is all I have left of him. It was his gift to the world, and I cannot leave it in the hands of my father." "I see," Yang hummed. Despite disagreeing and feeling Weiss really could honor the man with anything she did, she also understood how important it was for her, so chose not to go any further. So what are you going to do? I have no idea, Weiss replied with a deep sigh and took another sip of her drink. But I know that I am done waiting for it to be handed to me. What does that mean? She asked cautiously, raising an eyebrow at the woman. Are you going to take it or something? If I have to, Weiss said with a resolute nod. I don't know how I am going to do it yet, but if Father used the company against Winter, then he will certainly use it against you. So I don't really have a choice, because I am not giving up either of you. At Weiss' declaration, Yang felt her heart flutter and squeezed her girlfriend's hand reassuring. If that was the path Weiss was determined to take, then she was determined to travel it with her. Well, Yang hummed and reached for the glass of water to take a swig. He can't do to me what he did to that Roman guy. We own our house and Dad wouldn't sell it to anyone. True, but that doesn't mean he can't do other things, Yang, Weiss said and turned to face her. I highly doubt you being former White fan won't come into play at some point. Then I'll deal with it when it comes, Yang said firmly and gave Weiss a nervous smile. Though if I'm being honest, your sister scares me more at the minute. You never told me she was so terrifying. Because she isn't, Weiss said, finally giving a small chuckle. I am pretty sure she's just wearing her military clothes to scare you, but when you get to know her, she's actually really supportive. In her own way. I hope she eventually likes me enough for me to get to know that side of her. Yang smiled at the certainty in her girlfriend's voice. But if she left Roman to keep you safe, then I can believe it. I actually expected you to be more angry about that part, honestly. I am angry about that, Weiss said, though her calm tone carried some form of understanding to it. I hate that Father used me to control her, and that she put her life on hold for me, but I've always known that's how Father is since he uses Mother against me all the time, so it doesn't surprise me. I also know that him and Winter have always been at each other's throats, but I guess this sheds some light on some of the reasons why. A little unnerved by how easily Weiss talked about it, Yang rubbed her thumb over the back of the woman's hand and felt Weiss lean on her head on her shoulder. Picking up the water, Yang took another sip and let Weiss clear her thoughts in peace, but after a couple of seconds, she heard the woman let out a small sigh. Yang? I know you don't like me asking this, but I have to make sure, Weiss said slowly, Yang knowing the question that she had expected to come since the woman had stormed from the room. With everything you just heard, are you still certain this is what you want? Without a doubt, Yang replied the moment Weiss had finished asking and wrapped an arm around her, hearing a relieved sigh. Good, Weiss said as she lifted her head off Yang's shoulder. Turning to look at the girl, Yang was surprised by a pair of lips suddenly pressing softly against her own, and never being one to turn down some affection from her snowflake, she happily sank into the moment. A slight disappointment filled her as Weiss pulled away seconds later, but it quickly faded as she saw the smile on the woman's face. I love being able to do that in one of my family's houses. Grinning in return, Yang pressed her lips back against Weiss for a second before also pulling back. So do I. Good. She smiled and stood up, picking up the glass of water with her. But I think we should get back to my sister. I'm pretty sure she had more to tell us. Alrighty, Yang replied as she stood up with her, only to realize she was stood in front of the blue-eyed woman who was waiting for her to move first. You can lead the way. I already kinda got lost once while looking for you. Weiss let out a soft chuckle as she rolled her eyes and took her hand, guiding them both back through the house to the room where Winter was likely still waiting for them. Watching Weiss hesitate slightly before pushing the door open, Yang gave the woman a small smile that was quickly returned as she took an audible breath and pushed it open for them to enter. Upon entering, they saw that Winter was no longer sat in her chair. Instead, she stood by the window that looked out over the pool. From the slight reflection Yang could see in the glass, there was a look on the woman's face that she couldn't quite place, a look that was somewhere between fondness and sadness. Taking a seat on the couch they had been sitting on before, they waited for Winter, who had not even acknowledged their return, to join them, and after a couple of minutes of tense silence, she finally turned to face them. Have you finally calmed down? She asked Weiss, her tone blunt but not unkind. Sorry, Weiss replied, a little disappointment at herself evident in her tone. It is understandable, Winter sighed, walking around the chair and dropping back into it. It's not like I expected you to take it lightly. The way Winter's eyes surveyed them both sent a small chill through Yang, like the woman was seeing more about them than Yang had ever known existed. Fortunately, the eyes did not linger on them too long, as Winter let out a low sigh and interlocked her fingers. While father's actions were cruel, Winter continued, breaking the brief silence that had arisen in the room, I too am responsible for some of the mistakes made. I was arrogant. I knew what father was capable of and believed I would be able to handle it, but all I had was my anger. My anger at how he treated us, and how he broke our mother, and at how he ruined our name. If only I had known back then that anger alone does not win you a battle. While emotions can grant you strength, it is never wise to let them overpower you, yet I did, and in doing so I forgot that I had no leverage. Then how am I supposed to beat him? Weiss asked, a hint of uncertainty tinting her tone. By being smarter than I was, Winter countered sharply, her eyes narrowing on her sister. Fortunately, I believe that you already are, due to the fact that you reached out for my help. It shows that you are taking this seriously, that you are not underestimating our father. All I have done so far is hide us from him. Weiss sighed and Yang tightened her grip on the girl hand reassuring, as Weiss had done to her that morning. Even if I am careful, I don't have any leverage yet either. You sell yourself short, sister, Winter replied shortly, raising an eyebrow at her. You have more leverage than you think you do. Despite growing up with grandfather being a prevalent figure in my life, I was never interested in running company, so I never had reason to fight for it, but that is not the case for you, Weiss. Ever when you were a child, you were enthralled with grandfather's tales, and the company has been your goal ever since. You have taken your role as heiress to heart, but heiress to the Schnee Technology Company is a title that means people are watching. As such, even your short time as overseer of the research and development department has caused people to take an interest. Looking to her side, Yang saw Weiss' brow furrowed in confusion, and apparently so did Winter, as the older woman continued. In the past couple of months, you have done a number of things to catch the attention of certain people. It is no secret that the Elysian military works closely with Merlot Industries, and therefore, we keep a very close on what happens there. The convincing of one of their top researchers to join the STC is not something we simply gloss over. There is also Dr. Polandina, who has not had cause to be in contact with the Remnant Medical Research Foundation for a couple of years, but recently reached out for a new project that began around your appointment to his department. The same project that General Ironwood is interested in, if I am not mistaken. But the General turned down our request for funding, because it would be unwise for the military to invest in an uncertainty, but that does not mean he is not interested and won't reconsider when further results are shown. Winter countered quickly with a stern look. I also had the luxury of meeting an old business associate of grandfather's shortly before I came to Vale, a man who has not shown any interest in the STC since father began to take control. Yet even he seemed interested in what you have been doing there lately. As I said, sister, Winter said with finality and leaned back in her chair. Your title means you are being watched closely, and people are impressed by what they have seen so far. Though Winter was only talking to Weiss, Yang couldn't help but smile as pride for her girlfriend welled within her. Looking to her side, she saw that Weiss was smiling too, and though Yang wanted to wrap the snowy-haired girl in a tight hug, she didn't know how Winter would react, so settled for stroking circles on the back of the woman's hand with her thumb. I tell you this for two reasons, Winter continued after a couple of seconds. The first is so you know that should you capitalize on this favorable impression, reach out and continue to make these connections, then you will have leverage you need, as father will not be able to oust you from the company as easily. Understood, Weiss replied with a short nod. And the second reason? Winter's face fell before answering, and her eyes turned to Yang, the pale blue orb so much like her sister's, but holding a hint of coldness that she had never seen in the younger woman's. The moment they locked onto hers, Yang felt like she had been plunged into ice-cold water, and knew that her next words were going to be a harsh truth. The second is because of you, Miss Xiaolong, Winter answered, her gaze unblinking and her voice hard as stone. I want you to know that this is what my sister is capable of at just 18, that she is already making great strides to turn her dream a reality, that are already being noticed. Despite the cold tone, Yang heard something else in the woman's voice, and she doubted any sister wouldn't have recognized it instantly. Pride? However, that tone quickly turned darker as she leaned forward in her chair. And I also want you to know that it is for you that she is putting all of that at risk. At those words, Yang felt Weiss' hand tense and glanced to see the woman at her side open her mouth to retort, only to shut it again as Winter held up a finger in warning. Now I swore years ago that I would never force my sister's hand on something, that every decision she makes will be her own. But that does not mean I will approve of them all, nor does it mean that I will give her my blessing on all of them. Even without your past affiliations, this upcoming fight will be tough, but with them, it will cast doubt on everything she does. So I will ask you this one time, Miss Xiaolong, how do I know you are worth it? Yang had no idea what to say. The question was a difficult one at the best of times when she didn't even know if she was worth it, but with Winter staring right into her eyes, she knew the woman would spot a lie the instant it was told. Glancing slightly to her side at Weiss, she knew that there could be no help from her girlfriend as it was a question that only she could answer. So looking back at the older Schnee, Yang took a deep and decided that the only thing she could do was be honest. You can't, she said plainly, earning a raised eyebrow from the woman. If I'm honest, I still don't think I am worth it. All I know for certain is that I love Weiss. Giving her girlfriend's hand a squeeze, she received a small smile that spurred her on. I've been unable to think about anyone else since she stepped into the store, and every day I've spent with her, everything I've learned about her since, had just made me more and more certain that she is everything I need. I know that you probably still doubt that I'm worth it, but I also know that I can't do anything to change your mind. All I can do is show Weiss exactly how much I love her every day and hope that, one day, you believe it too. Once she finished, Yang turned to look at Weiss, and was surprised, as a pair of lips pressed ever so gently against her own. Before she could react, Weiss pulled away and gave her a happy smile. I love you too, the woman whispered, causing Yang's heart to flutter a little as she returned the smile, after which Weiss turned to look at her sister, who had been watching them intently. I already told you, she is worth the risk to me. Winter continued to watch them for a couple of seconds before sitting back in her chair and giving a slight nod, though Yang doubted that the woman's mind had been changed very much. However, Weiss still let out a sigh of relief from beside her. Fair enough, the older woman said plainly, and interlocked her fingers again. As you both seem certain this is a fight you are willing to undertake, then I shall help you where I can, though what good it will do, I don't know. Whatever help you can give will be greatly appreciated, Yang replied, Weiss giving a short nod at her side. I don't want Weiss to lose the company for me. Then my first suggestion would be to continue as you have been, Weiss, Winter said firmly. Submit yourself as an asset to the company. Reach out and connect where you can so that Father has to weigh the odds of losing you. Second would be something that I attempted yet failed at. While Father must be made aware first, as soon as he is, make your relationship known to the public. This will be difficult since I learned the hard way that Father has his hands in the media, but like with every other controversy he has had, you only need one to report the story, and then the rest will have to print it or be exposed for taking money to cover stuff up. Third, this time, Winter turned to look at Yang instead of Weiss, and she knew what was to come. Do not attempt to hide your past. It will come out regardless and play a part in how Father reacts, so hiding it would only cast more doubt. Giving Winter a short nod, the woman's eyes lingered on her a little longer before turning to look at both her and Weiss in turn. Lastly, she said, her voice taking on a much more serious tone than it had before. Do not underestimate Jacques Schnee. Be it your job, your house, or your family, there is nothing that is off limits to him. He will attack you from every angle he can to get his way, so you had better make sure that everyone you love is aware and willing to take that risk with you. As Winter said that, Yang's most immediate worry was Ruby. While she knew Ruby wouldn't care and would tell her to go ahead anyway, the idea of something happening still made her uncomfortable enough that she knew it would have to be talked about at some point. Fortunately, Weiss seemed to have understood her thoughts as Yang felt her hand being squeezed gently and turned to look at her girlfriend. I won't let anything happen to Ruby, she said with a smile. I promise. I know, Yang replied softly, only for Winter to say what they both knew to be the truth. You may find that promise hard to keep. Giving Winter an appreciative nod, Yang sat back on the couch and felt Weiss lean into her a little, earning a slight stare from the older woman. Well then, unless you have any more questions for me, I have things that must be taken care of downtown. As she felt Weiss shaking her head, a question came to Yang's mind, and though she was hesitant to ask it, she cautiously raised her hand slightly. Feeling stupid at the action, like she was back in school again, she watched Winter raise an eyebrow as permission to ask. Yang paused for a second, thinking how best to phrase the question so that it didn't sound like an accusation. You said you left Roman to keep Weiss safe, but you still left? I'm just curious why. Winter looked her in the eye as she asked her, the ice blue eyes holding a chilling intensity to them. But for what felt like the first time, they were not unkind, more understanding than anything. After a minute, that could have in fact been hours in that capturing gaze, Winter gave a small nod and let out a resigned sigh. I promise you, I did not do so lightly, she said, a gentleness Yang hadn't heard before seeping into the woman's voice. I tried to stay for as long as I could, but Roman's prediction about the situation at home becoming more and more unbearable came true. Barely a day passed where Father didn't purposely remind me that he had beaten me. I watched Mother slowly fall more and more into alcohol, and despite my attempts to stay composed, more nights than I care to admit were spent crying at the hopelessness of my situation. I was tired of fighting Father, tired of the beatings that came from it, tired of crying every night, Winter said quietly and looked at her lap, as though what she was about to say was something she was ashamed of. So I finally fulfilled my promise to Roman. It had grown to be too much, so I allowed myself to be selfish. I turned to the only person who could help Mother. I begged her to help me, day after day, until I somehow managed to break through the alcohol. I guess she finally saw how desperate I was, and reached out to General Ironwood, since he was an old college friend. She knew that the military was the only thing that the STC didn't have its claws into. They did business, but it was the only place that Father had no sway, so she convinced General Ironwood to allow me into basic training. I think sending me off to the military is finally what made her fully succumb to drink. Once Winter was finished, Yang regretted having even asked. Looking to the girl at her side, she saw Weiss watching her older sister with intrigue until she finally gave a brief nod. I'm glad you left, Weiss said suddenly, causing both Yang and Winter to look at her in interest. I mean, I missed you every day, but you made the right decision. Thank you, sister, Winter said, and gave a smile that actually lit up her features and made her seem much less scary for once. Any other questions? With nothing else to ask, not that she would dare after hearing that answer, Yang gave a small shake of her head, Weiss doing the same at her side. Seemingly satisfied with that reply, Winter stood from her chair and picked up her cup and saucer, holding the small pieces of china out to Weiss. A small look of confusion passed over the younger sister's face, and Winter raised an eyebrow, as if her request was clear. Please take this back to the kitchen for me, Winter said in a firm voice, and fetch my scarf from the upstairs closet. The intention behind the request was very clear to both of them, and in truth, Yang had been expecting it. She had highly doubted that the day would pass without Winter cornering her for a one-to-one conversation, so after receiving a small look from Weiss, Yang gave her a brief nod. Feeling slightly nervous as her girlfriend took the cup and walked out of the room, she watched Winter walk over to a cabinet along the wall and fiddle with something that she couldn't see before walking back with a closed fist and sitting down opposite her. I will keep the brief as I really do not have long, so you will stay quiet and listen to every word I have to say, the woman ordered darkly and reached into her jacket's inner pocket to pull out a brown folder which she placed on the table. This is your file, and I made sure to study it completely this morning when it was given to me. Swallowing slightly as she looked at the small brown folder, Yang quickly looked back up as Winter began to speak. While not a lot in there suggests you truly are a threat, that does not mean you are not one. Holding out the fist, Winter dropped what she had retrieved from the cupboard, something that was unmistakable to anyone. A single bullet. You have a sister, so I am sure you will understand that I must do everything I feel is right to protect mine. Now, I have told you about the threat that is my father, but let me tell you about the threat that is me. While I am, for all intents and purposes, disowned, I am still a Shnee. A Shnee with the full power and reach of the Atlesian military behind her. Should I ever discover that this file misled me, that your intentions towards my sister are ill in any way whatsoever, you will find that where I can reach is much further than my father can. Be it in the black market of Mistral or northern forest of Vacuo, you will never escape me. Placing a long finger on the bullet, Winter raised an eyebrow pointedly, and Yang understood her meaning with absolute clarity. Fortunately, while Winter wanted her to feel fear, Yang knew that that circumstance would never come to pass. Do I make myself clear, Miss Xiao Long? Crystal. Good. Then woman said in a low voice as she stood from her chair, picking up the bullet and placing it back in the cupboard and walking towards the door. Keep that file, she said, and pulled open the door. Use it to work out how you will explain each incident in there when your past is inevitably made public. Without another word, Winter left the room, Weiss just coming into view at the end of the hallway before the door was closed. Letting out a sigh of relief that the meeting had not been as bad as she had expected, she leaned back on the couch and waited for Weiss to return. Fortunately, she didn't have to wait that long, as a couple of minutes later, the door opened again and Weiss walked in. Giving the gorgeous woman a smile, Yang held out an arm, and Weiss happily sat down on the couch to lean into the hug, her feet coming up so that she could get more comfortable. "Everything go okay?" Weiss asked, the curiosity in her voice evident. "Yup," Yang replied, not wanting to tell Weiss that her sister had essentially just threatened her life. "Just the normal sisterly warning." Though the hum she returned was clearly a disbelieving one, the snowy-haired woman didn't press any further. "So you got anything else to do today?" "Nope," she replied and shook her head. "And Winter ordered the staff away from the house until tomorrow, so we can relax here for today if you want." Leaning down to place a kiss on the top of her girlfriend's head, Yang let out a light chuckle and tightened the hug a little. "Sounds perfect to me, Snowflake." Chapter 35. A Necessary Risk. Weiss Schnee. A distinct sadness fell over Weiss as she hovered the mouse cursor over the option that shut down the computer. It felt insane to her to think that it had already been just over 3 months since she had started her position in the Research and Development Department in the STC. But then again, those 3 months were also spent with Yang, who seemed to possess the uncanny ability to make time fly. However, while Winter had said during their meeting a couple of days ago that she had already done quite a lot, it hardly felt like she had done anything. She had issued orders, fought with Arthur, and rearranged management at the dock factory after what she had discovered there, but everything Winter gave her credit for was hardly her work. The chip that was being researched was hardly her effort. Sure, she had ordered it and put Dr. Polendina in charge of it, but it was still him and his team that were doing all the work. They were the one doing the research. Dr. Polendina was the one who had successfully reached out to the RMRF. As for Mrs. Jotties, the woman already held an interest in working at the STC, so much so that she had already previously applied for the job. All Weiss had done was correct a mistake that should never have been made. It still felt like there was more she could do, more factories and warehouses she could sort out due to her direct dealings with them, more employees, like Seal, who showed promise, but just needed a small push to achieve it. The sad part came from the fact that she knew there would be none of that when the new year started, and she returned to her place in the accounting department, even though she certainly did have some goals she wished to achieve there. So it was with a deep sigh that she finally pressed the mouse button and watched the screen turn to black. Standing up, she slung her bag over her shoulder and slowly moved her way towards the door, taking one last look at the small little room she had made her own. It wasn't much, but the tiny office with its single desk and 2 chairs had been where she had first started to feel like she was actually doing some good, like she was finally living her dream. However, she knew it wasn't time for her dream to become a reality yet, so giving the office as warm a smile as she could to say thank you for serving her so well, she flicked the light switch and pulled open the door to leave. "Are you sad to be leaving, ma'am?" "More than I can express, Seal," Weiss replied softly to the girl, who was also packing up the last of her things. "You?" "More excited," Seal chuckled, the smile on her face clearly not one she was controlling. "My time here has been very insightful, and I will miss the friends I've made, but I finally get a chance at what I've wanted all that time." "Well then," giving the girl a small nod of her head as she closed the door to the room she had just left, Weiss turned to face her ex-receptionist. "I am glad to have played some part in making your dreams come true. I also have a little something for you." As a small confused crease pulled at the Elysian girl's eyebrows, Weiss put her hand into her bag and rummaged around for a couple of seconds. Eventually she found the small, wrapped present she had bought during her shopping trip with Winter when she had arrived and held it out to Seal. "A parting Christmas gift," Weiss smiled as Seal cautiously reached out to take it. "And a thank you for being such a help during my time here. You can open it now or wait another couple of days." Waiting patiently while the navy-haired girl decided what to do, Weiss watched thoughts rush past the girl's eyes. However, while Weiss had expected Seal's natural desire for everything being done at the correct time to win out, she was pleasantly surprised to see her gently pull open one of the tabs that held the parcel closed. Once all the paper was removed, the only thing that remained was a plain black box that she quickly opened to reveal a watch, the light instantly catching the dark blue face and golden hands to make them shine. "It's Seal breathed with an odd look on her face, tenderly running a finger over the silver strap, as if she was scared of breaking it. "This is an incredibly expensive gift, Miss Schnee." "Well, your help really was invaluable," Weiss replied smoothly, letting a genuine smile pull at her lips. "So was your friendship, so it only seems fitting. And please, I'm no longer your boss, so Weiss is fine." "I don't know if I can accept this," the girl said shakily, removing her finger and looking up. "Well, I refuse to take it back." Weiss chuckled stubbornly, replacing her bag back on her shoulder and crossing arms. "So what you do with it is up to you, though I do hope you keep it." Again, Weiss saw thoughts rush past the girl's eyes, and let a grin pull at her lips. While she and Seal were not the closest people ever, Weiss had learned enough about her over the last couple of months to know that the idea of accepting such a timepiece was going against all of the girl's hesitations. Thankfully, those suspicions turned out to be true, and excitement replaced the doubt in the timekeeper's eyes. "Then I suppose I have no choice but to accept." Seal smiled, her finger returning to touch the silver band before carefully shutting the box and placing it on her desk. "It has been a pleasure to work with you, Weiss." "The pleasure is all mine, Seal," she chuckled, returning the smile and holding out her hand, which the girl accepted and shook. "Though I expect your new position will make sure we still see each fairly regularly." "Then I look forward to it." Letting go of the girl's hand and giving her a small nod, Weiss turned and walked towards the door, turning back to give a short wave before pushing it open and walking down the hallway. As she passed Arthur's door, she contemplated knocking to say goodbye to the man who had challenged her so much, but wanting to end the experience on a good note, she chose not to and simply continued towards the elevator. Letting out a deep sigh as she pulled out yet another file from her bedroom desk, she let herself hope that it was finally the right one. If she ever needed another reminder to actually sort out her research material after she was finished with it, then the past hour she had spent looking for the specific file she had written a paper on over a month ago certainly served as a stark one. Thankfully, as she opened the file and saw it titled Fletch Air Tech, she knew she had found the right one and placed it on her desk. As she quickly read through it to make sure it was the right one, which it was, the memory of being wrapped in Yang's arms on her bed came flooding back to her, and despite her extreme tiredness, a warm smile tugged at her lips. With Winter's recent advice of reaching out and making connections to cement her importance, Weiss had spent the past couple of days trying to figure exactly how she could do that, but every thought she had felt too small. However, the idea had finally come to her in a dream, which was more of a wonderful memory of the night with Yang than a dream, and it had woken her at 4 in the morning. After a quick 15-minute shower in which she had decided against washing her hair fully until later, as it would take far too long to dry, Weiss had begun to search through her drawers. The name of the company had seemed familiar even back then, and the entire time she was searching, she had racked her brain to figure out why. Fortunately, the memory had clicked, and she remembered her first day back of her position in the R&D department that she read a project submittal that had been repeatedly blocked by an outside patent registered under the very same company name that was written on the file she had just dug out, more specifically to a man named Auburn Fletch, as the company had since shut down. While she would have to wait until the morning to request the actual files regarding the STC's apparent interest in such a project from the office, she could search up the patent on the public database. So sitting down at her desk, her slightly damp hair falling down her back, she zipped up the jacket she had borrowed from Yang so that she would stay warm and got down to work. It wasn't until several hours later that Weiss finally leaned back in her chair to let out a wide yawn. While much of the file was already known to her, looking at it under a new light had revealed some things of interest to her. First was that with the patent at hand, the constant refusal of the project was understandable, as it was reliant on much of the same things that Mr. Fletch had intended to use, even down to how it was physically designed. The patent that Mr. Fletch held was actually rather revolutionary, detailing plans for a commercial plane that would rely solely on solar power, except for a small fuel supply in case of emergency landings, and would almost completely cut off the heavy price that fuel cost airlines. That cost decrease would mean that the prices of building and maintaining would be a little higher, but it would ultimately mean that the travel expenses would be almost cut in half, so that everyone had much easier access to travel the world. However, as the business had been in a complete decline by the time he had been awarded the patent, he had lacked the necessary funds to start manufacturing a prototype. That was where the second new piece of interesting information came in. Having received the files regarding the attempted acquisitions over the years from Watts, it appeared that the STC had tried numerous times over the years to acquire said patent, but every time they tried, the man outright refused to accept their offer. Unfortunately, the filings didn't say why, but as it was written in the notes that both Merlot Industries and Marigold Innovations had also expressed an interest in the project and were both also turned down, Weiss had to assume the man had his reasons. However, those reasons only made her more interested in the potential that lay unused. There was no doubt in her mind that the development of such a project could do so much good for both consumers and for the cost of imports. So for it to have been so readily refused every time was more than enough to make her determined to see what was going on there, because if she was able to secure such an elusive patent, then it would definitely make an impression. So letting out a deep sigh as she stretched out her shoulders, she reached down and pulled out a fresh notepad from her desk, planning to note down everything she could, even if it seemed irrelevant. An hour later, Weiss had managed to fill almost half off the notepad with whatever information felt relevant. Admittedly, she doubted that half of what she had written down was going to actually be useful, but to remedy that she was using some highlighters to make the important bits for easier location in future. However, just as she was checking through the halfway point of her notes, a small knock sounded from her door. "Come in," she called straight away, knowing it was likely Klein with her morning coffee. Much to her surprise, however, as she looked up to greet the man, she saw her brother standing in the doorway instead. Dressed in his usual blue vest, which was unbuttoned, white shirt, and tie, the boy looked better than he had over the last few days. For the last couple of days, the boy had looked a little rougher than usual, choosing to let his hair simply hang down than having it swept to the side, but he had clearly made the effort today as his hair was back in its neat position. As she gave him a once-over, she saw in his right hand was a small stack of books, the left still bandaged and resting on top of him. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying some of its usual confidence, though having heard it so often, Weiss could tell it was still lacking somewhat. "Good morning, brother," Weiss said with a smile, honoring her promise and placing her highlighter down to give him her attention. A small second passed, Whitley's icy blue eyes boring into hers, as he was clearly unsure how to react to her warmer than usual greeting. Finally, he let out a small sigh and slightly held up the books in his hand. "I've come to return these." "Oh, thank you." She smiled and stood from her chair to walk over and take them from him. "Did they help at all?" "Lo." His words were cut off by a short hiss as Weiss accidentally caught the bandaged hand. Recovering before she could even apologize, Whitley gave her a short nod. "A lot." "I'm glad," she said kindly, letting the moderately heavy stack fall into her arms, so that she could place them on the edge of her desk. Turning to face him again, she saw him watching her intently, and quickly tried to find something to comment on. "It's good to see you in your vest again," she said meekly, unsure about the attempt at small talk. "It was strange seeing you in just your shirt over the last couple of days." "The buttons are a pain to do," he said bluntly, his eyes not dropping the intensity for a single second. "Oh." Her eyes darted immediately to the boy's hand. "Is it feeling better now, though?" "A little," he replied, though the tone of voice he used made Weiss unsure as to whether it was the truth or not. "Why are you being so nice all of a sudden?" Caught off guard by the question, Weiss' eyes shot up to meet her brother's. Though while she expecting to see anger or annoyance in them, she was instead met by genuine confusion. "Whit, do you actually care, sister?" he said, and though his voice turned slightly colder, she could easily tell that he was purposely making it that way. "Or are you simply trying to make yourself feel better about doing nothing but cast me aside over the years?" Weiss felt her heart drop a little at that statement, because it was partially true. Ever since Winter had left, Weiss knew she had created a distance between herself and her family because it was easier to be self-absorbed than watching it break apart, but she no longer felt that way. "I'm trying to make things right," she said softly, and sat on her bed. "I know things have been difficult between us, and that I am to blame for a lot of that, but I meant what I said the other day, Whitley. I really do care about you, and I want to close this gap that we have let widen. And if I don't want that, then I will have to live with the regret of my mistake." Weiss sighed sadly, hoping to convey that she really wished that wasn't what he wanted. Thankfully, the boy didn't make a move towards the door. Instead, he simply stood there and stared into her eyes, obviously searching for a lie that didn't exist. "Why now?" he asked, the coldness and restraint gone from his voice, making him sound much younger. "Did Winter tell you?" "No," Weiss interrupted him with a shake of her head. "Winter hasn't told me to do anything." "Then why?" Because I don't like this distance anymore, Whitley, Weiss said firmly, making sure he could see it in her eyes. That night when you came to my room and asked me if I cared that you hurt your hand, it felt horrible to watch you walk away thinking such a thing. For you to believe that you meant so little to me. I don't. The voice was so quiet that Weiss almost didn't hear it, but even though she did, she was still left slightly confused by its meaning. Feeling it was safe, she gently pushed the boy a little. Don't what? Looking away from her for the first time, the boy let out a small sigh and shook his head slightly. I don't believe that, he breathed, his face turning slightly downcast. I was angry and wanted to hurt you is all. Well, you certainly did that. Weiss sighed in return and stood to make her way over to the boy. Stopping in front of him, she reached out and took hold of each side of his vest and began to slowly button it up for him. But I suppose that was a good thing you did, since it made me realize what was important. The boy looked down at his feet. A rare occurrence for him, the boy didn't reply. Instead, he allowed her to finish up the last button. She reached up and straightened out his lapels. With everything sorted out, she gave him a small sigh and looked down at his hand. I suppose that is partially my fault too, she said remorsefully and reached out to take it, surprised that he allowed her. Are you going to tell me what you did to it? Trapped it in a door, he lied in a low mumble. MHM, she hummed, making it obvious that she didn't believe him. Must have been shut rather hard. Again, he didn't reply, but did wince as she gently lifted his middle finger. You should really get it looked at, Whitley. I can't go to a hospital, he said, shaking his head a little. Why? She asked, despite knowing that it was because the doctors would be able to tell instantly that it was not an injury from being caught in a door, and would immediately tell their father. I just can't, he said firmly, sticking to his lie. Letting out a deep sigh at the boy's stubbornness, Weiss let his hand go so he could gently lower it back to his side. She knew the hand needed to be looked at, but if he refused to go to the hospital, then she knew there would be nothing she could do to make him go. However, wanting to do something, Weiss thought through how she could get it looked at when a stupid idea formed in her head. It was reckless and risky, but there was no other option. Any private or public doctor they went to would recognize them immediately and reach out to their father, so what choice did she have? The choice was tough, and she wasn't keen on the risks, but he was her brother, and it was more important to make sure his hand was okay. So letting out a small sigh, she stepped away from Whitley and moved over to her desk to pick up her scroll. Scrolling through her contacts, she found the one she wanted and after a brief hesitation, hit the call button. Giving the confused-looking boy a small glance, the call tone only rang twice before they picked up. Morning, beautiful, her girlfriend said happily from the other side. What's up with the early call? I need your help with something, Weiss replied, suppressing the smile that tried to force its way onto her face as Whitley was watching her. Shoot? How often have you injured your hand? What? Yang asked, the confusion in her voice clear as day. I just need to know. Well, the girl hummed thoughtfully. I'm a boxer, so I'm surprised I can still use them. Why? So you will know if something is really wrong? She asked, hearing a shifting sound from the other end of the call. Yes, the girl said shortly, the confusion immediately replaced with worrying. Weiss, what? I'm fine, but I can't explain right now. Weiss sighed in resignation. I'm on my way over. If that's okay. It's always okay, the blonde replied, the worry in her voice abated a little. I'm guessing I should get the first aid kit ready? Probably for the best. Weiss agreed and looked at Whitley. But I have to call Hazel, so I have to go. See you soon, Yang. Hanging up the phone, Weiss searched through her phone for Hazel's number and addressed her brother. Go and get a coat, we are going out, she said, making her voice as authoritarian as she could while keeping it kind. I already said I can't go to the hose. We are not going to a hospital, she interrupted firmly, finding Hazel's number and sending him a pickup request. I am taking you to see a friend. Looking at her with suspicious eyes, he didn't move, and Weiss rolled her eyes at him a little and reached into her closet for a scarf that was on a peg just behind the door. Just trust me this once, please. A couple more seconds of silence passed, but finally the boy gave a small nod of his head and left the room. Letting out a sigh of relief that some progress had finally been made with him, she also acknowledged how risky what she was about to do was. "Thank you, Hazel," Wise said gratefully as she leaned into the window, earning the usual tilt of his head in return. "I'm not sure how long we will be, so take the morning off." "You sure?" "Quite." She smiled with a nod of her own. "I shall message you when we are ready to leave." "All right," he replied gruffly, his eyes momentarily flicking over to Whitley, who was stood slightly behind her before rolling up the window. Stepping back, and the car slowly pulled away, Wise turned to look at her brother and the house that stood behind him to see the slight ruffling of the curtains, a clear indication that Yang had heard their arrival. The boy, however, was looking around, his pale blue eyes scanning each and every house, something he had done ever since he was a child, but his stance was one of boredom, his hands clasped behind his back with his shoulders slightly hunched as he shivered. Not wanting to keep him out in the cold, nor wanting to stay out in it herself, Weiss walked over to him and indicated for him to follow her. Though she knew there was no going back, Weiss still hesitated as they reached the door, but quickly pushed the thoughts out of her mind and reached out to tap the door, knowing Yang would be right behind it already. Just as she suspected, less than a second passed before the handle turned and the shining beauty that was Yang stood in the entryway with a cautious smile on her face. "Morning." Yang grinned happily, though the girl clearly understood that she had to act restrained by the fact that the word beautiful didn't finish that greeting. With the same smile, the alluring lilac eyes moved over to Whitley as she held her hand out. "You must be Weiss' brother. Whitley, right?" Accepting the offered hand, Whitley gave her a curious look. "I am," he replied, his voice inquisitive as always. "And you are?" "This is Yang," Weiss answered, stepping into the house as Yang stepped aside. "And mind your manners." "It's fine, no manners needed in this house." Yang laughed and closed the door behind them both before leaning into the living room. "Hey, Rubes." "She's in the toilet," interrupted a familiar male voice from behind the door. "What's up?" "About time. Thought she was gonna burst after chugging that bottle. Anyway, do you mind showing Whitley through to the kitchen for me?" "Sure," the voice said, and a small boy around Whitley's ages walked into the hallway. Had only seen him a couple of times since Ruby's party. She had seen Oscar a couple of times since, but it was usually in passing as him and Ruby rushed either to the girl's bedroom or out of the house. "Follow me." "Oh, I'm Oscar, by the way." "MHM," Whitley hummed in response, looking at Weiss and Yang with a raised eyebrow quickly and following the brown-haired boy. "I'll be through in a minute," Weiss said as he entered the living room and moved out of sight. Turning to Yang, she saw that the blonde was watching the boys carefully, but finally she closed the living room door. "Sorry I didn't give you much warning." "It's cool," the beaming blonde replied and placed her hands on Weiss' waist and pulled her close. "Can't say I'm not a little surprised though. I thought you weren't too keen on your brother finding out about us." "And I'm still not." Weiss sighed and let her hand trail up the boxer's strong, exposed arms, enjoying the warmth that was pushing away the shivers that the wind had caused. "Not yet anyway, but he refused to get his hand seen at a hospital, and you were the only person I could think of that could help." "Well then," Yang shrugged as Weiss put her arms around the back of the woman's neck and let her fingers tangle themselves in the mane of blonde hair. "Guess it can't be helped. I told Ruby and Oscar to keep us quiet when I saw you both outside." "Oscar knows?" "Yeah, sorry. I think Rube slipped up a little, but he's like family, so it won't be an issue." "It's fine," Weiss sighed, leaning up on her toes to press her lips gently against her girlfriend's for a second, the action making her entire body warm up much quicker than the house heating had. Pulling away, she let out a small resigned sigh and gave her a smile. "It's not like it will matter soon anyway. MHM, can't wait to show you off to all my friends properly." A small grin spread over Yang's face, and she stuck out her tongue, causing Weiss to roll her eyes. Letting you a chuckle, she let go of her waist and took a step back toward the living room door. "But for now, we should go and see what your brother has done to his hand." Placing her hand on the door, Yang turned around to face her, the wide smile back on her face as she looked her up and down. "By the way, nice jacket." "Thanks." Looking down, Weiss remembered she was actually wearing the jacket he had taken from Yang and felt a small smirk cross her face. "Someone special gave it to me." "Ah." Yang cooed happily and stuck out her tongue again. "Love you too, Weiss cream." Rolling her eyes and blushing as she remembered the last time Yang said the name, she followed her girlfriend through the door and into the room. Unlike the last time she had been there, the room was no longer just a soft, warm brown. While the warm comfort the room usually exuded was still present, multicolored light glinted from every corner of the room, giving it a more festive atmosphere. Green and silver tinsel draped the walls and ceiling, while pictures and Merry Christmas banners hung from the shelves. In the corner stood a large tree, its branches decorated with red and gold tinsel, while technicolor lights flashed softly, but instead of an angel topping it, a small figure of the family corgi stood watching proudly over the room. "You finally decorated?" she said as they made their way through the room. "Yup." Yang smiled and flicked one of the decorations. "Me and Ruby were up until 2 in the morning to get them finished the other day. They're very bright," Weiss hummed, not used to the shining decorations as they were never hung in her house. "I quite like them." "Yeah, Dad found an extra box in the back of the attic and Rubes insisted on putting those up too." Yang laughed as she pushed open the door, the sight of Whitley sitting at the table drink a glass of water, while Oscar poured himself one, greeting them both. "I'll tell Ruby you approve." As soon as the door opened, Whitley looked up at them both before glancing aside. Clearly Yang noticed too as she gave Weiss a small playful shrug and moved over to the sink, reaching into the cupboard below and pulling out a green box. "Hey, sapling," Yang said, ruffling Oscar's hair until he pulled away to straighten it. "Mind giving us the room?" "Sure, I'm gonna play Stardew Valley." "Alrighty, just stay off my save." Yang smiled and moved over to the table to place the box down. "Keep Rubes in there for me too, please." "Got it." With a small backwards wave, the boy left the room and shut the door behind him. Walking over to the sink, Weiss quickly pulled 2 glasses from a nearby cupboard and poured herself and Yang a glass of water before sitting down next to her brother and passing one to her girlfriend, who was fiddling with the contents of the box. "Thanks, B.A." Weiss froze slightly at the words, but thankfully caught her mistake before the sentence could be finished. Looking to her side to see if her brother had caught it too, she saw glad Whitley still staring rather boredly around the room, oblivious to what had almost happened. "Alright." Yang cleared her throat and put her hands on the table. "Let Dr. Yang take a look at you then." A short silence followed as Weiss smiled, and Whitley raised an eyebrow curiously, making Yang backtrack a little. "I swear someone will laugh at that joke one day." "I doubt it," Weiss replied teasingly, and turned to her brother. "You can trust her." It took another couple of seconds, but Whitley finally lifted his hand from his lap and placed it on the table. Giving it a short look at the bandages, Yang pulled a small pair of scissors from the box and cut away the knot that held them together before starting to gently unwind the fabric. Though she was being rather gentle, Whitley still let out the occasional wince. However, the wrappings were finally removed and Weiss had to suppress a small groan. While Weiss had been expecting them to look pretty bad, the dark purple bruising that covered 2 of Whitley's knuckles still made her stomach churn. They didn't look especially swollen, but the discoloration stood out starkly against his pale skin, and the scab that rested along the middle one showed that the skin had clearly been torn slightly. "You messed that up pretty well," Yang sighed and threw the scissors back into the box. "What did you hit?" "I trapped it in a door," Whitley replied, and received a disbelieving hum from the blonde. Knowing Whitley enough to understand he wouldn't confess himself, Weiss let out a small sigh and told the woman herself. "He punched a vase. A rather strong one." Almost immediately, Whitley looked at her with suspicious eyes, but was quickly forced to turn back to Yang and let out a small grunt as she lifted the middle finger up. "That hurts," he growled, his voice low and defensive. "I'm not surprised," Yang said, raising her own eyebrow at him. "Judging by the lack of cuts, I'm guessing it was made of china." A few seconds passed, but eventually Whitley gave a small nod. "Yeah, that'll do it. So will not knowing how to angle your punch properly." "I would rather he didn't know how to punch one properly next time, Yang," Weiss scolded her girlfriend, only receiving a smirk in return. Yeah. Yang laughed gently and lifted then hand off the table. "I just want to check how you can use it, okay? Do what I say, and if it hurts, tell me how much." Giving Yang a short nod, he let Yin guide him through what she needed. Very slowly, she made him move the affected fingers, both side to side and up and down. It caused him a little pain, but he was still able to do it. Afterwards, she held out a finger and asked him to squeeze as hard as he could, This one caused him a little more trouble and made him wince a lot more. Watching her brother go through each order, she couldn't help but be amazed at how patient and gentle her girlfriend was being, letting him take his time and not caring about the growls he would let out at her when she pushed him to a point where it hurt too much. Finally, though, the small examination ended with Yang feeling his knuckles and the top of his fingers, but she eventually set the hand back down with what looked to be a satisfied smile. "How does it look?" Weiss asked as Yang dug back through the box quickly to pull out a few things. "Well, he can still move his fingers okay, his grip strength is decent, and there's no swelling, so I'm guessing it hurts less now than when you did it," Yang replied gently as she ripped open what looked to be a wet wipe, Whitley giving another small nod in return. "Then I really doubt anything's broken. Most likely just a bruised knuckle that's taking its sweet time to heal." Breathing out a small sigh of relief at the news, Weiss watched Yang carefully clean the area around the scabbed middle knuckle, her nose wrinkling at the strong smell of the antiseptic wipe. Once she was done, the blonde quickly wrapped a bandage around the hand and stood up to walk over to the freezer. Leaning over, she pulled out a bright blue ice pack and then pulled open a nearby drawer. "Damn it," Yang sighed to herself, shoving stuff aside noisily. "Where did she—" "Never mind." Pushing the drawer closed, Yang let out another sigh and walked back over to the table to hand the ice pack to Whitley. "Ice it for 15 minutes every 3 hours, okay?" "Sure," he answered in his usual bored tone, though he quickly took the blue packet and pressed it against his hand with a groan. "Good, I have something else that will help too, but I have to ask Ruby where she put it," she said, her words clearly meant for Weiss. "Might take a while to find." Understanding that Yang was trying to give them some time alone, Weiss gave her girlfriend a soft smile and mouthed a thank you as the brawler left the room. Once the door clicked shut, an awkward silence fell over them both as Whitley tended to his injury. While she wanted to ask him how it was, the small wince he gave as he touched the ice back to his knuckle was more than enough to answer her question. Watching him inspect the bandage, she let out a small sigh and took a sip of water. However, at that moment Whitley decided to speak, and what he said almost made her choke on the cold liquid. "Your girlfriend seems nice." Spluttering as she cleared her airways, Weiss set her water down and looked at her brother. Now paying attention to him fully, she could see that he was watching her out of the corner of his eye with a curious look, and as their eyes met, she noticed the same curious glint that they always held. "We're in not." Weiss tried to lie as if her reaction hadn't given away exactly how spot on he was with his assumption, only receiving a roll of the boy's eyes as he looked away. Knowing it was pointless, she took a stab in the dark. "How long have you known?" "A couple of weeks." He shrugged, his demeanor still one of practiced boredom. "You two are not exactly subtle about it either." "Oh!" Weiss exclaimed, a little worried that if he had noticed, that others might have too. "How did you find out?" The boy didn't reply straight away, choosing instead to lean back in his chair so that it shifted onto its back legs. Waiting patiently as she knew rushing him never did anyone any good, Weiss took another sip of water to clear her tingling throat. After what felt like a couple of minutes, her brother let out a small sigh and let the chair legs fall back to the ground. "Do you remember when we were children? Back in Atlas?" he asked, and while he wasn't looking at her, there was a hint of genuine curiosity in his voice. "When you and Winter would run off into the small forest behind our mansion?" "I do," Weiss said easily, as those childhood memories were among her most treasured. "We would spend hours in there, but you would always come looking for us, and we would take you back. But what does this have to do with how you found out?" "MMM," he hummed, ignoring the question while picking up his own drink and taking a small sip. "Did you ever figure out how I would always find you?" Thinking back, she vaguely remembered questioning it, but had never actually asked him. "No. Our namesake would always guide me," he replied cryptically, making Weiss all the more confused. Receiving a small look from him, she saw a small smirk pull at his lips. "Snow's sister. It holds footprints rather well." Though she was still confused, Weiss knew her brother was trying to tell her something, albeit in his own frustrating way. Watching the boy as she thought of what he had said, her mind floated back to when Whitley could have potentially found out. It had apparently been It had first started snowing weeks ago, the very same day Yang had snuck into her room. She even remembered brushing snow off her girlfriend's shoulders, meaning she would have left footprints on her way to the tree that led to her balcony. How had she been so stupid to not think of that at the time? And how had Whitley come across the information? Thankfully, she didn't have to wait long as she looked at her brother and saw him watching her. The night guard saw them and went to report it, he elaborated, clearly knowing she had worked it out. Luckily for you, he came to me first. He came to you? Weiss asked, only getting more confused as any intrusion would normally be reported straight to their father. Yes, he replied blandly, drawing swirling lines in the condensation of his glass. As do many of the other staff when they hear something that shouldn't be spread. Like the cleaner who was running late to client's meeting, who saw you and a blonde girl talking nearby the theater room the day after I was informed about the footsteps in the garden. Or the cook who informed me that Viola was saying you had not spent the night at the townhouse when you said you did. Shocked by how much power Whitley had over the staff, Weiss remembered the conversation that she had overheard in the library, where Klein had implied Whitley had been doing things she didn't know about. Had he been making sure things were kept from her father? The mere thought caused a small smile to pull at her lips, but while she certainly felt grateful, she couldn't help but be suspicious of exactly how he had managed such control. And why do these people report to you? Because they wish to keep their jobs, he replied simply, confirming her suspicions. Turning to look at him, she saw him roll his piercing blue eyes at her. Do not attempt to lecture me, sister. I do not care if it is not what you would do. It works, and that is all I care about. Watching the boy take a sip from his drink, Weiss couldn't help but feel sad. That move was straight out of their father's playbook. Blackmail and bribery were often his way of handling situations, and for Whitley to be so okay with copying them at such a young age felt wrong to her. However, she also knew she couldn't change it. That didn't mean she was going to accept it. I am guessing you learned that from father? She asked cautiously due to no longer knowing where his opinion laid on the man. Previously she had thought he worshipped him, but if he was hiding things then maybe that wasn't the case. Yes, he said unapologetically but let out a small wince as he pressed the ice pack back against his hand. Whitley, Weiss sighed, turning in her chair to face him a little better. Father's lessons should not be copied. Well, they are the only lessons I have been taught, sister, he replied without hesitation, a small amount of venom sneaking back into his voice. He may not have been kind or loving, but at least he was there. That's more than you, Winter, and Mother ever did for me. Weiss had no reply to that retort as she knew it was true, but apparently after all day playing nice, or at least nicer than usual, the annoyance had finally returned and he stood up from the table causing the chair to scrap along the floor and walked over to the sink. Whittle, do you and Winter have any idea how lucky you both are? He spat as he turned on the tap to fill his glass. Because you have both spent the last few years whining about how life has been unfair to you, when you two have had everything. Placing the glass aside without turning around, Weiss watched her brother's uninjured hand grip the edge of the counter with a white-knuckle grip and decided against correcting him. He clearly had something to get off his chest, and for once, Weiss was going to let him. Winter, he said with pure loathing in his voice. Raised by mother and grandfather, shown nothing but love by the both of them yet still feel she was treated unfairly when she did the exact same thing she hated. Finally, the boy turned around and Weiss saw that his eyes were narrowed to point from anger and his nose pulled into a sneer. Do you know the clearest memory I have of her? The question was rhetorical, but Weiss still felt the need to shake her head. Her screaming at me. I found her crying in her room and tried to comfort her, and all she did was shout that she wanted nothing to do with me, with us. I remember her pushing me out of the room and slamming the door in my face. But you? The next day she took you shopping, because it was your birthday, and you were her precious sister. Every day from that point she barely even looked at me, choosing instead to argue with father and then take you out, leaving me alone to deal with the anger she caused. And then she left without even a goodbye, and while you got letters and phone calls, not once did she ever bother contact me. And you? He sneered, and while there wasn't anywhere near as much venom in his voice as when he had spoken of Winter, Weiss still felt shame pulse through her. Same thing. But you didn't scream at me when she left, or simply forget about me. No, you were openly disgusted by me. You think I didn't see your sneers become more frequent as I grew up, that I didn't know that you hated me for looking like the man who made your sister leave. Yet it was you who was sat in your room, crying and spiteful while I was left alone with father, again. Grandfather, the man you both respect so much, gone before I knew him. Mother, too busy drowning herself in alcohol by the time I grew up. Winter, not caring whether I was around or not. And you, despising me for something I had no control over. The only person I had left to turn to was father. Watching the boy hang his head as he stopped talking, Weiss gently stood up from her seat and walked over to the sink to tip her water away. As she had listened to the boy talk, she had found herself feeling worse and worse as everything her had said about her was true. She had completely shut him out because he looked like their father. She had distanced herself and left the boy alone, and as time went on, the result of that had become clear is how the boy began to act. Placing the glass on the side to wash before she left, Weiss placed a hand on her brother's shoulder only for him to shrug it away. "You are right," she sighed, picking the glass up since she wasn't able to comfort her brother and washing it. "About me at least. I have treated you poorly over the years, and for that I apologize. When Winter left, I felt like my world came crashing down around me. She was always there for me after Mother, well you know, but when she left I felt like I had nothing, and I found it much easier to shut down and push people away. But you were wrong about us having it better. It may not seem like it to you, and the actual story isn't mine to tell, but Father took so much from our sister, he hurt her in ways that no father should even be capable of doing. You two still had Mother and each other. All I had was beatings from the only person to even acknowledge I exist. We did, but that also meant we were aware of what was happening when Mother began to break down. We remember Grandfather, Winter especially, for both. I'm not trying to diminish what you've been through, because right, I cannot imagine how awful it was being left alone with Father so much. Though suspect I will be incurring his wrath very soon, but I promise you that I will not leave you to deal with him alone anymore. We are a family, and it is about time we dealt with what has been tearing us apart." "What do you mean?" he replied, the confusion and inquisitiveness in his voice pushing through the anger. "Well, I am sure you know what will happen when I tell Father of my relationship with Young," she sighed, and put the glass on the drying rack. "I can take a guess. He will attempt to take my position away from me," Weiss said, wanting to make sure they were both on the same page. "And I will not let him, nor am I giving up what I have with Young. So I've decided to take the company from him." "Why are you telling me this?" Whitley replied, turning to look at her for the first time since he had left the table. "Are you not worried I will tell Father?" "A little," she said honestly, not wanting to tell a lie he would see straight through. "But you haven't told him about me and Young, so I think I am right in saying you are not too fond of our father either." "I hold no particular favor towards him," Whitley said blandly. "He may have been the only person I had and taught me many things, but I have never deluded myself into thinking he cares. Nor have I been blind to what he is capable of." "Good," Weiss replied, picking up the towel that hung over a nearby drawer handle to dry her hands, and turned around to lean back against the counter. "Because Father will be giving it to you, and while I am not going to ask for your help, I am going to ask you don't intervene. I don't want you caught in the crossfire." "And if I want the company, sister?" the stony-faced boy asked impassively, the truth of whether he did or not impossible to make out. "Will you take it from me too?" Meeting his gaze, Weiss felt her stomach drop slightly. She knew it was likely that Whitley would want the company too, but that didn't change what she needed to do. While she wanted to mend things with her brother, the company was hers. She had spent her entire life working for it, and she alone could take it from their father. So knowing it would be best for her to be honest before complications arose, Weiss let out a small sigh and gave a short nod. "Yes." A sharp sidelong glance was thrown her way as Whitley pushed himself off the counter and moved back to the table with his water in silence, and Weiss worried she had once again annoyed the boy. Thankfully, after a sip of water, the boy put the glass down and gave a small shrug of his shoulders. "I have no interest in running the company, sister," he replied firmly, not looking back at her, but instead towards the door with a tilted head. "I do not want hand-me-downs, so I intend to take what I learned from there and forge my own. Father may think me his puppet, but he will soon learn that it was in fact him who was mine." "Well then," Weiss sighed from relief and sat down next to him. "Until then, you know you'll have a place in the company when I reclaim it, right? You sound so sure that you will win," he said slowly, head turning away from the door to face Weiss and raising his voice a little. "Neither of you think he will let it go without a fight, do you?" A moment of confusion fell upon her as to why he had said it so loud, but it quickly faded as the door to the living room was slowly pushed open and Yang stood there scratching her head sheepishly. Staring at her girlfriend, Weiss rolled her eyes with a smile and motioned that she could come in, which she did and quickly sat down. "Sorry," It's fine, Weiss replied, turning back to her brother as Yang fiddled with a box. And to answer your question, yes. Because we have no other choice. Moments passed in silence after her answer as the young Schnee took his time to think. While he did, Yang pulled what seemed to be a bunch of gloves from the box and inspected each one, tooted as she dropping them to the side and pulling more out. After what Weiss counted to be the 5th glove, she noticed the confused look Weiss was giving her. Splints, she explained, holding up one of the gloves to show a small area where Weiss knew a metal rod should have been. Or at least they were, until Ruby stole all the rods from them for her contraptions. Weiss smiled at her girlfriend and watched her continue to sort through the gloves. Finally, after what had to have been more than 10, she found one that had not yet been gutted and pulled the metal rod from it. Picking up one of the fingerless white ones she had discarded, she slid it back into place in the new one and passed it to Whitley. Here you go. She grinned and waited for the boy to take it. Should keep your fingers straight so that you can't move them and aggravate the knuckles even more. After a quick look over it, the boy slowly pushed his hand inside and attempted to flex his fingers, finding that his pointer, pinky, and thumb were the only ones capable of moving. Should speed up the healing too, but I'm not a doctor, so if your hand hasn't started to feel better by the end of the week, then you will need to actually get it checked out. MHM. He hummed noncommittally and took a small sip of his water. Well, that's all I can do for it, Yang said politely and leaned back in the chair, unfazed by the lack of gratitude the boy showed. You can go and sit in the front room if you want. Ruby stole the switch off Oscar for some smash, and she's pretty bad at it, so I'm sure she will give you a shot and you can whoop her, but even with your busted hand. Clearly understanding that it was a polite request to let them have the room, the boy stood from his chair and made his way towards the door. However, just as his uninjured hand closed over the metal handle, he stopped and looked over his shoulder at them both. I will not get in your way, sister, he said, his tone making it clear that there was a caveat. But I will not help either. I will not put my future or the perception I have worked so hard to have father believe at risk should your plan fail. I understand, Weiss replied gently, giving her brother an appreciative before he pulled open the door and exited the room. Silence filled the room once the boy left, and Weiss stood up, mimicking her earlier action of cleaning her own glass with Whitley's own abandoned one. As she washed it, she thought she felt Yang's eyes boring into the back of her head, but was instead happy to feel a pair of hands snake around her waist from behind and a warm body press against her back. Letting the fragrant smell of lavender wash over her, Weiss melted backwards, trusting the woman to support her more relaxed position. He, seems nice. He's an ass, Weiss admitted, earning a soft chuckle from the delectable blonde that breezed pleasant across her neck. But I guess he has his reasons to be one. MMM, Yang hummed, pressing her lips against her neck as she did so that Weiss let out a soft sigh. So I guess you told him about us? He figured it out on his own, she answered, finishing washing the glass, but not moving from her comfortable position. He acts bored so often that it's easy to forget to how attentive he is. Not when looking at his eyes, the boxer replied, her fingers linking over Weiss' stomach. Damn things felt like he could see into my head whenever I caught them. Wouldn't surprise me, Weiss smiled, her head moving to the side as Yang nuzzled her neck. And I am guessed from what I overheard. You mean what you eavesdropped on? Weiss corrected the woman. Maybe, Yang replied, Weiss feeling the lips on her neck pull into a smile. But I'm guessing that conversation means you are going ahead with that plan of yours. Yeah. The word was little more than a whisper, as she was a little too busy enjoying the affections being laid upon her. Have you talked to Ruby about it? MHM. She hummed again in reply, and this time Weiss let out a soft moan. I know what you are trying to do, she breathed, feeling butterflies fill her stomach as a kiss was placed just under her ear. And what is that? The voice was whispered in her ear, and finally Weiss felt her resolve crumble. Twisting around in the wonderful woman's arms, she quickly found herself looking up onto a pair of mischievous lilac eyes, and placed a loving kiss on the blonde's lips. While it was still more chaste than many they had shared a few days ago at the town house, warmth still flooded her body as Yang's hands on her back pulled her in even deeper. Unfortunately, Weiss knew she wouldn't be able to stay at Yang's very long, and she really didn't want to get worked up and spend the day that way. So after a few seconds, she pulled away and opened her eyes to gaze into her girlfriend's. I appreciate it, she said genuinely, happy that Yang could tell when her mind needed to be taken off things. But I'm fine. You sure? Yang asked, seriousness slipping into her light tone. Some of that sounded pretty heavy. We have some things to work out still. Wise sighed and leaned into her girlfriend's chest, strong arms moving to wrap around her shoulders and embrace her. But it's a first step. That's true, the brawler said softly, the words almost unheard as she enjoyed the sound of Yang's strong heartbeat. So what are you gonna do now? Right now, Weiss replied and pulled back slightly. Well, everyone in this house knows about us, so maybe hang out here for another hour with you? I can get behind that. Yang grinned and placed a quick kiss on her. Looks like we have enough for a small tournament. You are really going to make me play that blasted machine again? Yup. Yang chuckled, gently poking her nose as she took a step back, her other arm sliding down Weiss to take her hand and pulling her along. But for a small price, I could be convinced to take it easy on you. Despite knowing that she would likely still lose in the first round, Weiss still rolled her eyes at the small tease and leaned in to kiss her girlfriend. Pulling back, she watched Yang stick her tongue out teasingly and couldn't help but let out a small giggle as the girl turned and left the room, pulling her along with her. What the? Oscar's surprised tone petered out as his eyes looked at the windscreen of the video game, Whitley's character named Pitt taking up most of the screen, while Yang's bulky male character that she had already forgotten the name of sat in the corner. While Weiss had only intended to stay at the house for an hour at most, the time had practically flown since the start of the tournament. Just as she suspected she would, Weiss had immediately been eliminated by Yang, even though the blonde was clearly giving her more than enough of a chance, and spent the rest of the fight snuggled up close to her girlfriend. Whitley, however, had taken to the game in a way Weiss hadn't seen him with anything in quite some time. The boy had quickly understood the controls, to the point where he had managed to make it to the final round of the first tournament, and in the second, he had pretty much wiped the floor with everyone, even Yang, who Weiss could tell had thrown away all leniency and was genuinely trying to win. During the tournaments, however, Whitley had also been doing something that she had expected even less than him, excelling at a game he had never played before, and that was to maintain a casual conversation with Oscar, who had been sat on the chair next to him. How the hell are you so good? Oscar continued, catching the control that Yang gently threw to him before returning her arm back around Weiss. Yeah, Ruby added and laid back on the couch, her head landing on her sister's lap with her shining silver eyes looking up at Weiss with a smile as her legs hung over the arm. You said you've never played before. It's not exactly hard, Whitley replied to them both rather blandly as he watched Oscar bring up a training mode. The button combinations are quite easy to figure out, and all I have to do is get you off the ledge and keep you off. You hear that, Rubes? Yan said with a teasing tone and looked down at her sister. You need to keep people off the edge. Shut up, the small redhead replied and stuck out her tongue, only for Yang to reach down to grab it and miss by a hair. It's harder than it looks. I'm with Ruby on this one, Weiss admitted, earning a grin from the girl below. At least she can get them off the edge in the first place, Whitley chimed in, and Weiss thought she saw a hint of a smirk on the boy as he placed his controller aside and watched Oscar play in the practice area. Oh! Yang chuckled and gave her a sideways look as she poked Ruby's nose. You just got roasted, babe. No comeback. I'll let him have this one. Weiss grinned, watching Ruby bat away the hand that began to lightly pinching the tip of her nose. Yang, the girl whined, her voice slightly distorted from her sister's playful action. Let me go. Rolling her eyes with a smile as the two engaged in a small tussle, with Ruby trying to get free and Yang refusing to leave her alone, Weiss looked over to the other pair in the room and caught her brother watching them. She had noticed it a couple of times during the afternoon, but every time it had happened he had quickly looked away. However, this time, his attention lingered on them a little longer and Weiss gave him a soft smile, and while it wasn't returned, the anger she had seen in his eyes a few hours ago was completely absent. After a couple of seconds, though, the young boy turned back to the screen and pointed to something Oscar was doing wrong. Alrighty, Yang said happily to her side, Weiss turning back to see that she had finally released Ruby's nose. I need a drink. Do you and Whitley want another, or do you have to go? Glancing at the clock that was half buried beneath green tinsel, Weiss saw that it was almost 3 in the afternoon and knew they unfortunately had to leave very soon. So with a small hint of sadness, she gave her girlfriend a small shake of her head. We have to go in a minute. I still have a ton of research to get done. Got it, Yang replied, the tiny hint of disappointment in her tone obvious as she tapped Ruby's head to get her to move and stood up. Taking the hand that the blonde offered to her, Weiss allowed herself to be pulled off the couch, only to land in her grinning girlfriend's arms. So I'm guessing I won't see you until after Christmas now? Unfortunately, Weiss smiled at the beaming blonde. But I already gave your present to Blake so she could give it to your dad. What? Yang asked in mock offense, the grin ruining any believability her voice possessed. Don't you trust me to save it until Christmas? Not one bit. Weiss laughed in return and quickly pressed her lips against her girlfriend's before pulling back and looking into the lovely lilac eyes. But I do have to go. All right. Yang chuckled and Weiss felt the arms around her release. I got you something too, but you will have to wait until Christmas to get it. What? She replied, slightly confused by how such a thing could happen when the woman had just admitted herself that they wouldn't be seeing each other until after the holiday. How do? Nuh-uh, Yang interrupted with a smile. Sorry, Snowflake. That's a surprise you'll have to wait for. Shaking her head at the woman's playfulness, Weiss pressed another short kiss on Yang's lips before turning to her brother, who had already stood up and was putting his coat on. Are you ready? She asked, receiving a brief nod in response. Satisfied with the response, she turned back to Yang and gave her a warm smile. Love you. Love you too, princess. Feeling a grin pull at her lips at the name she despised anyone but Yang calling her, Weiss motioned for Whitley to follow her as she made her way towards the door. Have a good Christmas, you two, she called back to Ruby and Oscar, both returning the sentiment and Oscar even giving Whitley a little wave that he, to her surprise, returned. With one last wave to Yang, Weiss walked into the corridor and pulled open the door, the cold, winter wind hitting her neck and making her feel like she had been covered in ice. Letting Whitley go first, she pulled out her scroll to ping Hazel, who she knew would not be far away, and in preparation to face the cold outdoors, she pulled the collar on Yang's jacket tighter and stepped through the door. Sorry, she said in a slightly loud voice than usual to be heard over the roaring wind as she closed the door, hoping a little conversation would keep her mind off of the weather. I didn't intend to stay that long. It's fine, Whitley replied, his hands in his coat pockets, but still shivering slightly. If I had anything better to do then, I would have called my own driver anyway. Good, she breathed, regretting it immediately as cold air rushed into her mouth and stung her throat. Did you at least enjoy yourself? It was tolerable, he shrugged, his tone almost dismissive, but carrying a hint of sincerity. I suppose there are worse ways to spend an afternoon. There definitely is, Weiss replied, unable to keep the smile from her face, as Whitley turned to face her with a raised eyebrow. So you two are saying you love each other already? The question had been as blunt as one could possibly be, and the tone one of slight doubt. She understood why, of course, but she happily gave him another smile and a nod in return. We have been together for months now, and we don't intend to stop that, so yes. He hummed, turning back to the road as a car she recognized as her own appeared at the end of the street. Well, I suppose you could do worse. Thanks, she replied and walked up to his side as Hazel pulled up to the sidewalk. Once the car came to a stop, Weiss quickly pulled the door open and stood aside for her brother to enter first. However, as he took a step forward to enter the car, the boy stopped and looked over his shoulder towards her. For what it is worth, sister, I am glad you are happy, he sighed, and even Weiss heard the jealousy in his voice. But do not plan your future with her just yet. Understanding that it was meant as advice, Weiss gave Whitley a nod as he stepped into the car and took one last glance at Yang's house. As much as she appreciated the boy's words, Winter's too, she knew that there was nothing that would tear them apart. So with a small smile, she turned back to the car and stepped inside, the warmth immediately making her breathe out a sigh of relief.
And that's all for today, thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.